Thanks everyone for coming out today, and thanks especially to the Urban Studies Foundation for having us. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this work. Okay, so this presentation and symposium is catching me mid-iteration between theory construction and fieldwork. I'm just going to hold this up because I have very bad eyesight. So today I'm going to give an empirical update of the field research so far. I'll change this. So here's the outline. So an empirical update of the field research so far, and then I'm going to get into some theoretical challenges this initial round of fieldwork has presented me with. So, but of course, no one comes to the field theoretically bereft. So first, I'm going to get into a bit of the results from my PhD research to show you some ideas that I've been carrying with me into the field as I start this project. I want this presentation to build towards discussing a possible framing for the project in terms of using Gillian Hart's approach to relational comparison that emphasizes both critical ethnography and conjunctural analysis. And I do this in order to think about how public utility transformation in both Detroit and Puerto Rico are specific spatializations of what Catherine McKittrick calls plantation futures. So before I get to that point, however, I want to present a story of the role of the utilities in the bankruptcies of Detroit and Puerto Rico. I'm going to walk you through the historically racialized dynamics of municipal bond market in the US, and then through the general contours of the bankruptcies to emphasize that Detroit and Puerto Rico are not random victims of financial circumstance, but representative of the intersection of race, financialization, and disaster. And also, I just want to note here at the outset that I haven't done any fieldwork in Puerto Rico yet. That's scheduled for January and February. So this presentation is definitely skewed towards Detroit, but I'll be mentioning Puerto Rico a bit as well. But most of the details are focused on Detroit. And so rather than drawing any hard conclusions at this early stage in the process, I'm going to end the presentation with some thoughts on where I anticipate this project going and what kind of theoretical contributions it can make. So, as a researcher, I'm interested in questions looking at austerity-driven urban transformations, and I generally conduct research from the perspectives of institutional political economy and theories of racial capitalism. So my work is thematically centered on two areas: financialized processes of urban social reproduction, by which I mean how are cities paying for municipal services and other infrastructures, and also how are those services being distributed within and across the urban fabric of the United States. And the second research theme of mine is environmental justice in the context of climate change. And here I try to work with community organizations who focus on urban issues of environmental justice and sustainable futures in particular. So this on the right is a copy of the book Jackson Rising that the organization I worked with for my PhD research just put out, Cooperation Jackson, on their kind of experience putting together viable alternative economies. And right here, these come out of my PhD research. So this top graph is a chart of the growth of the US municipal bond market from 1980 to 2012. The municipal bond market, just FYI, is the market that local governments in the US use to borrow funds to make and maintain their cities. So this graph up top shows the market growing to $3.7 trillion over the past 30 plus years or so. And the gray shaded area right there marks the years between 2000 and 2008 when the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed and speculative finance was allowed to re-enter the muni market for the first time since the Great Depression. So during those years in the gray shaded areas, the market grew by over $254 billion each year. So the graph on the bottom right here represents the median interest rate acquired by the 21 largest Black majority cities in the US, and that's this red line, from the years 1970 to 2014. And this is as compared with all other cities in the muni market, which is the blue line. So this data comes from the Electronic Municipal Market Access website, and it represents over 5 million bonds issued by cities over these years. So it shows that starting around the same time as the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, as financial deregulation took place, right around 2000, Black majority cities started to acquire higher median interest rates than other cities in the market. So basically this means that it is now more expensive for Black majority cities to build and maintain their urban fabric and services. Okay, so here are the interest rate histories for the 6 largest Black majority cities in the US. So we can see this higher interest rate trend in basically all of them. Atlanta, and it's for the same years, displaying the same kind of interest rates. Some have 14% and some have 12% as the top. So this trend is particularly apparent in all of the cities except for Atlanta, which has a bit more of a complicated story. But we can see it very clearly in Detroit, which I'll be talking about today. Right around the 1998 to 2000 period, you can see that break with all other cities. So the point of presenting this data from my doctoral research is to show that the municipal bond market has become thoroughly racialized. So Black majority cities in particular have long histories of dispossession that have become entangled with processes of municipal finance, especially through credit ratings agencies and other institutions and mechanisms. And so this, I argue, is how historic and contemporary rounds of socio-spatial devaluation have become etched into urban landscapes. So I got this idea to study Black majority cities as a category of cities during my qualitative fieldwork in Jackson, Mississippi. So all of my interlocutors there consistently referred to and thought of what they call, quote, Black and brown cities as a group of urban areas especially prone to experiencing punitive state interference, for example, through laws regulating financial management or other types of draconian modes of governance and governmentality. So basically, through listening to the people I was interviewing, this is how I decided to analyze Black majority cities as a category. So this idea that Black and brown cities are experiencing a different kind of municipal financial conditions is borne out not only through the interest rate data, but through taking a look at the list of cities that have become insolvent since 2009. All of them except for one, Westfall Township, Pennsylvania, is either a majority Black or a majority Latinx city, or has a plurality of otherwise non-white residents. So this notion that majority Black and majority Latinx cities have an experimental status, especially within the governance of austerity urbanism, was reaffirmed for me in Detroit this past summer. So this quote is from Monica Lewis Patrick, pictured here. She's the co-founder of We the People, a Detroit and Flint-based organization that's focused on the financially induced water crisis happening in both of those cities. So she says that Detroit and Flint are, quote, sort of the canary in the mine for other communities that are going to fall prey to this kind of austerity. So for example, we actually knew in 2013 that Puerto Rico was going to be next, unquote. So this is the theoretical predisposition that I'm bringing with me into the field. And there is an implicit comparative move at work in this framing that I want to talk about in the conclusion if I have time. So I'm really excited that you said 25 or 30 minutes. So, okay. So Puerto Rico and Detroit currently occupy extremely vivid positions in the American imaginary. Detroit, mostly for its history of long-term decline and recent economic comeback after exiting municipal bankruptcy. There was recently like a conference of mayors that happened in Detroit celebrating its kind of resurgence and revitalization. And that was in September. Meanwhile, in Puerto Rico, the one-year anniversary of Hurricane Maria was just in September as well. So more lives were lost to Hurricane Maria last year in Puerto Rico than in the Gulf Coast, lost to Katrina in 2005. It's been called the most devastating natural disaster in the US in more than 100 years. So one of the reasons it was so disastrous is because of the island's underfunded and undermaintained power grid was essentially destroyed by the storm. This left Puerto Ricans to recover from the aftermath of a Category 5 hurricane without electrical power, as pictured here in the before and afters. So the sustained blackout following the hurricane led to a swath of secondary deaths as refrigerated medicines like insulin expired in the heat and as water systems shut down without power to run them, thus becoming contaminated with infectious bacteria that then spread to people who continued to use this system. So the point I want to emphasize here is that without electricity, everyday life as we have come to know it grinds to a halt. It is virtually impossible to function in the modern world without reliable access to a power grid, and the most vulnerable among us find it very hard to survive under such conditions. The same is also true of safe and sanitary water systems. So while for millions of Puerto Ricans it was a disaster of a hurricane that caused them to lose access to electrical power, for the past 4 years more than 100,000 Detroiters have been faced with the abrupt loss of their access to household water, another fundamental necessity of life. So this is happening through an austerity-induced policy calling for water shutoffs to any household owing $150 or more in unpaid water bills to the Detroit Water Department. So this is a policy promoted by the bankruptcy judge Stephen Rhodes and emergency manager Kevin Orr and carried out by the Water Department in an attempt to pay back debt, hundreds of millions of debt, a lot of which is illegitimate debt accumulated from LIBOR-manipulated interest rate swaps. So I'll say this again in a second, but I'm not going to get into the details of the LIBOR scandal today, but I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, so in terms of the embodied effects of the water shutoffs, patient diagnoses of water-associated illnesses like gastrointestinal or skin and soft tissue infections have been found to actually be correlated with block-level Detroit addresses of those experiencing shutoffs. And the findings have linked those most likely to be impacted by the shutoffs to be those who are also already the most socially vulnerable. So one of the largest ever hepatitis A outbreaks has also occurred in Detroit since the water shutoffs. Over 500 cases were reported in the state in 2017, and more than 800 cases and 25 deaths have occurred since the outbreak began. State officials have denied the connection between the shutoffs and the outbreak, but one of the primary ways Hep A is contracted is by consuming contaminated food or water, which residents maintain is happening on a widespread scale in Detroit. This happens when large parts of the water system are shut down for a really long time, again, allowing contaminants to collect, which are then spread throughout the entire system once the water is turned back on again. So while Detroit's water shutoff disaster is foremost a product of intentional policy, its lived experience is nevertheless one of disaster. As executive producer of the Detroit-based Allied Media Projects has said, quote, "The truth of what a disaster means to people who are living through one has to be the starting point of our conversation." So I also want to make a note here that what interests me about water and electricity is their necessity to life, and particularly to urban life. So people simply cannot subsist in cities as we currently know them without regular household access to water and electricity. The focus of my project is thus on understanding the racialized experience of disaster and disruption to basic processes of social reproduction caused by the absence of functioning water systems and power grids. The question of the unique agential capacities of water and electricity to processes of urbanization is not something I'm really taking up in this work, but again, I'm open to discussing this later on. So, in previous presentations, I've spent a lot of time unpacking the structure and the politics of the utility debt within each of the bankruptcies. So I've gone to explain the details of what interest rate swaps are, how the LIBOR scandal hurts cities in the muni bond market, and what vulture funds are doing in Puerto Rico. And this slide gestures to that part of the story. It shows the breakdown of the components of the Puerto Rican and Detroit debt. So right here up top, you can see the purple part of the circle of debt is the Detroit Water Department debt at $6.4 billion of the total amount of Detroit bankruptcy debt owing. So, and this slide right here shows PREPA, which is the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority. That their share of the total of Puerto Rican debt outstanding is $9 billion. And so that's just to show you kind of the ratio of how much debt is owed by these utilities as compared to the broader bankruptcies. But rather than focus on the nitty-gritty of finance, I want to discuss several of the ways that the afterlife of the Detroit utility bankruptcy still profoundly affects the social reproduction of everyday urban life. So again, we can definitely talk details in the Q&A if you have more questions about this, but I'm not really going to get into the specifics more than this. So the felt effects of the water department's money problems didn't just begin and end with the water shutoffs that I was talking about and that are still ongoing, but they've also circulated throughout important vectors of social reproduction in the city. So it's not only a question of utility privatization as a result of disaster, which is definitely on the table, and in fact the department has been regionalized, so it's now in control of the majority white suburbs surrounding the city of Detroit. So it's not just a question of processes of privatization, but it's also one of cascading effects into housing markets, school closures, and in Detroit specifically, the continued viability of specifically Black-owned businesses and churches. And just to be clear, these examples that I'm about to get into come from the initial round of Detroit fieldwork. And in subsequent returns to the field in Detroit, I'm planning on following one or more of these processes depending on how my connections with people on the ground there work out, following these processes in further detail. So I'm just going to describe what's happening here in these examples briefly, but I'm happy to answer further questions in the Q&A. So these are some of the post-bankruptcy circulations of urban political ecologies of financial crisis that are happening in Detroit. The first one is regarding tax foreclosures on residential houses and unpaid water bills and water shutoffs. So, all right. This comes from Monica Lewis Patrick's organization, We the People, this information. So basically in Detroit, up until very recently, and it's questionable as to whether or not it's actually stopped as a process, unpaid water bills were added on to property taxes of a residential property. And so if property taxes remain unpaid for 3 years, the property automatically goes into foreclosure, and there's an annual auction. It's the annual Wayne County tax foreclosure auction that happens to these foreclosed residences. And this is where global speculative finance buys these houses en masse very cheaply, with rental tenants often being unaware of this process until they receive an eviction notice. So basically this information is saying here that in 2014, the total amount of foreclosed properties in Wayne County that had delinquent water bills added to their property taxes was just about 12,000 properties. The average water bill due for these properties at the time of auction was almost $2,000. And the average minimum bid at the auction was about $13,000. So this is a process that's severely affecting the ability, the affordability of residents to continue renting in Detroit. And Josh Ackers has actually done a lot of work on these, on this situation in Detroit. So the next is water shutoffs in the Detroit public school system. So in August, the Detroit public school system shut off all the water in its schools because it found really high, or it found higher than the standard levels of lead and copper that should be allowed in the schools. So when Detroit public school children started back school, they're relying on philanthropic organizations to donate all their water needs to the school. So lead in school water systems obviously has implications for the developmental trajectories of children who are exposed to lead. It can also be used as leverage in defunding quote-unquote mismanaged public schools in favor of charter schools, which is an issue in Detroit. Its public school system is under emergency management, but it should be noted that charter schools use the same pipes as public schools. And importantly, federally, there's no national mandate to test school water sources for lead. So it's up to individual states to legislate this, and actually 44 states don't require it. So this is another big issue that's happening. And then the third issue has to do with the new water department. It switched its name from DWSD to GLEWA. And that's the regionalized entity. They've imposed a drainage tax or a drainage fee for impervious surfaces like concrete. And in the Motor City, there's a lot of concrete, especially if you have older buildings. And so this drainage fee is really high, and it disproportionately affects precarious Black-owned establishments in the city, including businesses and churches. So the Water Department expects to collect $153 million from these fees in 2019, which is $30 million more than they expect to collect in water rates. So this is a really egregious kind of fee. And there's actually a class action lawsuit that's happening over this right now. So these are examples of urban political ecologies that are happening post-bankruptcy in the city that involve water department debt that remained on the books. I also briefly want to point out the importance of circulating actors between these two places as well. So this is Judge Stephen Rhodes, who I mentioned previously, the bankruptcy judge for Detroit. He's the one who decided to leave the water department debt intact and enforce water shutoffs instead of seeking reductions in payments to investors. That's the choice he made. This same person was later hired by Puerto Rico as a consultant in their insolvency, as this news headline indicates. He was, the year later, after he was hired by Puerto Rico, he returned to Detroit to be named the emergency manager of the Detroit public school system. So following this particular research trail is kind of like going to the dark side of policy mobility's research. But it's really important to understand his influence in these bankruptcies. On the other side, however, there is the Detroit-Puerto Rico Solidarity Exchange Network. This group was formed by Detroit-based members of the Puerto Rico diaspora with the self-described goal of drawing connections between the fight against the appointments of emergency managers in Detroit and Puerto Rico's federally imposed oversight board, along with various resistances rooted in self-determination that are taking place by grassroots communities in Michigan, Puerto Rico, and elsewhere in the diaspora. So this group is focused on building new narratives that tell a different story of the continued resistance, experimentation, and grassroots projects that they believe present a real alternative to the rescue plans pushed forward by politicians and finance. So in January, I'll be conducting research in San Juan, Puerto Rico as a part of a solidarity stay with an affiliate of the Detroit, Puerto Rico Solidarity Exchange Network. So I'll be living and working with the organization CEPA, which is the Center for Embodied Pedagogy and Action, for about a month initially. And for about a month initially. And one of their first approaches to the embodied political ecology of disaster in Puerto Rico, I don't expect you to read all of this, but this is just from their website, was to distribute mental and physical health kits. So these kits included first aid items as well as various other items meant to sustain one's mental well-being in a time of crisis. You can't see, okay, so let's see. They think, called by some thinking with the body and not with the head, embodied pedagogy is an approach to education that rests on the assumption that we all have within us the capacity to generate new behaviors and responses to injustices that exist in the world. That's the main piece I want you to pull out of that. So members of the Detroit Puerto Rico Solidarity Exchange Network have told me that the major questions they continue to grapple with are this, and SEPA is a part of the Solidarity Network. Quote, what does it mean when you have poor infrastructure, no governmental support, no community relationships to access resources? How do you survive? What do you need to learn from each other because no one is coming for us? So that's what motivates their work and the meetings and conferences they're pulling together and workshops and other things. So members of SEPA have added on to that missive by asking how disaster changes our understanding of space and describing the afterlife of Hurricane Maria as a moment of spatial reorienting. So they see it as a return to the immediate community at hand in the aftermath of disaster, and then the beginning to seek viable economic, political, and social alternatives to imposed austerity. Okay, so with my last couple minutes here, I'll just conclude. But so these are the two stories that I'm following in this project. In the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that I wanted to approach a relational comparison between Detroit and Puerto Rico using Jillian Hart's version of relational comparison in conversation with Catherine McKittrick's notion of plantation futures. So she describes plantation futures as a conceptualization of time-space that tracks the plantation toward the prison and the impoverished and destroyed city sectors, and consequently brings into sharp focus the ways the plantation is an ongoing locus of anti-Black violence and death. So the bankruptcies of both the Detroit Water Department and the Puerto Rico Electric Authority are expressions of plantation futures, and that they're spatial reconfigurations wherein a white state usurps the democratic and economic autonomy of Black and Latinx municipal governments and spaces of cultural, economic, and social life. So on the face of it, these bankruptcies and their associated control boards and emergency managers and related socio-natural disasters are reorganizing patterns of social reproduction to extract the maximum economic value from multiple dimensions of social difference. Yet in the next breath, when she's writing here, McKittrick also says that for those of us interested in addressing race, space, and premature and preventable death, plantation futures demand decolonial thinking that is predicated on human life. She points to how plantation contexts have also bred modalities of survival: creolization, quote, the blues, marronage, revolutions, and more, unquote. So my insistence in remaining focused on the importance of water and electricity to collective urban life rather than focusing on the agency of non-sentient natures has precisely to do with this point. And I'm looking forward to finding out more about the modalities of survival being enacted by groups like We the People of Detroit, Detroit Puerto Rico Solidarity Exchange Network, and SEPA. I don't really have time to get into this, but the implied, if we go back to the Monica Lewis-Patrick quote, where she refers to cities like Detroit and Flint as canaries in the mines, the implicit comparative reference that I think she's making here is within a city system, comparing these kind of canary cities, as she puts it, these Black and brown cities, to other cities in the world system. So I think if we invert this context of a global city system, which has been described, I think, by one of the first theorists of world cities as islands of wealth surrounded by a lumpen proletariat. And I think that's Peter Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong. But if we view this same relationship of the global city system, the competitive global city system, not from the perspective of these islands of wealth, but from the perspective of these canary cities, I think that this highlights the plantation-style spatialities and accumulative logics at work within our world system. And so this is currently the iteration and the ideas that I'm bringing with me into the field in January to think more about and stress test. So thanks very much.